Hi, everybody. Welcome to another confined edition of The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Imprisoned in his Paris apartment, Daily Beast foreign editor Christopher Dickey. How are you?
There are worse places to be than my apartment, I assure you.
Okay. Sylvie Kauffmann, somewhere else in the French capital. How are you feeling?
I'm fine. Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
And from New Delhi, France 24's correspondent in India, Mandakini Gahlot. How are things on your end?
So far, so good.
I never thought I'd see the day when I would start an episode of The World This Week with that all-important, engrossing news story of Christopher Dickey going downstairs to buy a baguette. How was it, Chris?
It was fine. I mean, you're not supposed to stay out for more than about an hour. And we had to do marketing all over the neighborhood. So I got the baguette, we got meat, we got things in the grocery, we got all kinds of things. Fortunately, Le Notre is open these days. I was going to get some chocolate eclairs, but my time ran out and I had to come home.
Oh, okay. So you can only be out for, what is it, 1 hour, right?
About an hour, yeah. I'm not telling you we're suffering here.
Okay. How does week 3 feel?
It feels okay. It feels better than the alternative, which would be to be sick with COVID-19. I think the more we know about the disease, I think the more terrifying it becomes. There was a lot of complacency early on. I don't think we can be complacent anymore. And I've now talked to a number of people who have had the disease and have really suffered. And of course, I know people who've died, or know several people who've died. It's getting closer and closer. So staying inside for most of the time, almost all the time, it's no great sacrifice, really no great sacrifice at all, at least not for me, not for the people with me. My mother-in-law is here, and she's 96, so we are super careful with her.
Right, your mother-in-law, 96 years old. Sylvie Kauffmann, have you been able to go into the office?
Well, we don't anymore. We only have a skeleton staff operating from the office. The minimum people really physically needed, and the rest of it, we all do it as we're doing this program via video conferences and the internet. So I mean, it's we're doing it. It's fine, as most people who can work with the internet do these days. It's we're blessed, that we have this tool. Of course, I mean, I can't imagine what it would have been 20 years ago or 30 years ago. But at the same time, it's interesting. After a couple of weeks, we really value what we get from physical exchanges. I mean, video conferences are not the same as real meetings, and I think we'll be very glad to see each other and talk to each other physically again.
Mandakini Gahlot, what's the thing you miss the most from, you remember the old days when we weren't confined?
Well, I've had to move out of my house because I share my house with my mother. And once the lockdown was announced, I knew I was going to have to report it, be outside on the streets. And my mother's quite old. So I had to move out to a friend's place who has a spare room. So, well, I miss everything about my life. I miss my house. But again, I don't want to be complaining because there is a humanitarian crisis unfolding on the streets of Delhi and across India. And I'm one of the lucky ones that I have a place to stay and enough supplies. And like I said at the beginning, so far, so good.
Mandakini Gahlot, I know it's been hard on your sister. University campuses in the UK have been closed down, and she's a long way from home.
That's right. And she's in Leicester. And when India decided to shut down all international flights on March 22nd, there was a panic amongst the Indian students at her university, with a lot of people deciding to come back. And so we had to discuss it. And we saw what was happening with the students who came back. They were at the airport for 12, 20 hours, being taken away to quarantine in places that were, well, far from perfect. The sanitary conditions were bad. So we decided that she should stay on where she is. At least she has access to the NHS, which even when it is overwhelmed, is much, much better than what we have here, which is essentially a crumbling health infrastructure that is just not prepared to handle what's coming. So we decided as a family that it's better that she continues, being where she is. But of course, it's tough in isolation.
And it's tough again if you find yourself a long way from home, as international students throughout the globe have found themselves these past couple of weeks. Sylvie Kauffmann, in your newspaper Le Monde, one of your journalists went embedded at the start of the confinement to an old age home. This past week, they've begun to count the casualties from nursing homes and healthcare and assisted care facilities in France. Up to now, they hadn't been part of the official statistics, but we're only getting about 1/7 of all of the nursing homes in France counted so far. Quite a startling report by Florence Obnas, in which you see that, the carers are heroes, and those living in those nursing homes are heroes too.
Absolutely, yeah. You asked earlier how we manage as a newspaper, and I must say I talked about the technical part, but what our reporters are doing is also fantastic. I mean, everybody's really doing a great job, and it's quite an achievement, I think. So Florence is one of those great reporters, and she indeed spent 10 days in a nursing home with older people. And the story she tells is really moving, because, as we know, older people are the most vulnerable in this disease, in this pandemic, and we realize now that once the virus gets into a nursing home, it spreads incredibly quickly. So measures were taken quite early on, and visits were forbidden, were banned, and they've been banned for 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks now in nursing homes, which means that these people are, only see the staff. They can't see their relatives anymore. In some cases, they can't really meet among themselves, because if the disease gets into the nursing home, then people are confined to their individual room.
The nursing home she went to in the northwestern Paris suburb of Bagnolet, some of those living there showing a lot of pluck and phlegma. One woman I'm quoted as saying, "I was robbed of my youth by the war. I'm not going to let my old age get nicked by a virus."
Yeah, that's quite amazing. And it's true that this is a generation who went through the hardship of World War II. And in a way, they are more resilient because they've seen much more than the young people have seen. And they've been through all sorts of problems. And Bagnolet is in Seine-Saint-Denis, which is one of the poorer suburbs of Paris. And so we can imagine that the people who are in these nursing homes are not from privileged backgrounds. And they are, yes, to read this report is really moving, because their attitude towards life is quite philosophical in a way. It's simply put, but it's very philosophical. But it's also a very challenging account of the shortages that we are experiencing in France, because the staff, at least at the beginning, when Florence was there the first few days, didn't have enough masks, didn't have enough gloves, and you could see that they were really risking their lives being exposed to this risk.
I want to get back to that issue of the mask, because it's so important, and how you protect yourself as we start to think about deconfinement. But first, I want to rebound off of something you said with Christopher Dickey, which is that generation that was born before World War II. In those days, when the government told you to go to war, you went, you didn't ask questions. And today, this has been compared to a war. I suppose we don't perceive war the same way we used to.
No, but in some ways this is more horrible than a war, because you can't identify where the front line is. You can't see where the enemy is. It comes onto you, and all of a sudden you're hit and struck low. I was just reading biography of Ernest Hemingway, who survived World War I and who survived the Spanish flu epidemic. And he was much more terrified of dying from the flu than he was of dying in combat. And I think that people have to understand just how grave all this is, because it's like a war in that sense, but it's also like a war for the people who are trying to fight it, the emergency medical technicians, the doctors, the hospital workers of all kinds, even the people, including the people who clean the hospitals. They are all at tremendous risk. They are all absolutely at the end of their tether. The Daily Beast is based in New York City, which is now the global epicenter of this disease, and where thousands and thousands of people are going to die. I think more than 2,000 have died already. It goes up astronomically every day.
And you ran a piece by an emergency medical worker, one of the, who says that he quotes policemen as saying they're terrified of dying, and he also says people have lost, you know, that kind of gallows humor you have in high stress situations. People aren't making jokes anymore.
Well, he says, you know, there's a cynical humor among cops, among emergency medical workers. They're always telling kind of jokes that you would cringe at. But in fact, they don't tell those jokes anymore. This is all too serious, too grave. They don't laugh, and they are absolutely exhausted. They also don't have enough stuff to protect them. They can't, in many cases, go home to their families because they don't want to take the disease home to their families. There's just one thing after another piling up. It's an accretion of horror for all of them. And it's only going to get worse in New York City, much worse.
If New York, I'm reading, was a country, it would have the 4th highest casualty toll from this outbreak?
Sure, or if you want to look at it another way, if you compare it to South Korea, which acted quickly, was well prepared, and did what needed to be done, the 8 times more people have died in New York City alone than have died in South Korea. So it tells you about preparedness or lack of it in the United States, and it tells you the extent of the tragedy to come.
In India, they went almost overnight to a complete lockdown. Mandakini Gahlot, is there the sense when it comes to the infection rate and the casualty toll that you're waiting for the other shoe to drop?
Absolutely. The numbers as of now, India has about 2,300 cases, most of them in the last 3 or 4 days as the country's ramped up testing. But we are not testing enough people at all. Public health experts say that this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's quite likely that there are thousands of more cases that are not part of the official tally yet. I just want to give you an example now. Yesterday, last night, a 56-year-old man died. He tested positive after he died. He lived in Dharavi, which is one of the largest slum in India. Now, the authorities moved quickly. They sealed off 300 tenements, 60 shops. But this morning, there was another case from Dharavi. Now, Dharavi is 1 million people living on a plot of land that's slightly smaller than Central Park in Manhattan. So when cases show up in places like this, public health experts say they're going to rip through the population. And in about 2 weeks, we're likely to, this is what the experts say, we're likely to be where America is today or where Italy was 4 weeks ago. So it's going to grow in numbers, it's coming, and I'm not sure this country is prepared at all.
And were you expecting that great migration we saw a week ago when the lockdown was announced, with migrant workers returning to their home states?
No, I wasn't. But what's worse is that the government wasn't either. The Prime Minister announced this lockdown, and it's a move that's been hailed quite a bit. He had no choice. But then he only gave people 4 hours notice. That was just not enough time for migrant workers to go back to wherever they came from. These are daily wage earners. They earn, a living daily. They live wherever they work on construction sites, on railway platforms, and they come from villages which they could have gone back to if they had had enough notice, but they just didn't. And now some are calling it one of the longest marches in modern Indian history. I've been out on the streets. It's just tragic, Francois. The homeless population has just swollen because of the lockdown, because so many people have been evicted out of the shanties they were living in, or the tenements they were living in, because they can no longer pay rent, because they no longer have the job that they had. So it's really an emerging humanitarian crisis that could grow to be as big as the COVID outbreak here.
Sylvie Kauffmann, your reaction?
Well, I think we have been focused in Europe. We have been focused on our own crisis because they've been horrifying, of course, in Italy, in Spain, in France mostly. But we have to be aware that in the background, it's coming in the emerging world too, in the developing world. And I mean, in France, we've been particularly watching what's going on in Africa, because, you know, when it starts in Africa, just as what you have been describing in India, the health infrastructure is definitely not comparable to what we have in Europe or even in the US, and it's going to be very, very difficult. So it will probably mean that it will probably be another wave in this pandemic. So this is really something we have, even though the emergency and the epicenter of the pandemic seems to be in Europe and in the US now, we have to be very, very much prepared to what's going to happen in the rest of the world.
And it's provoking a scramble for resources, it seems. One story in particular has triggered a bit of outrage here in France, and that is the eastern Alsace region, hardest hit initially by the COVID-19 outbreak, which has seen itself lose face masks that it had purchased from China to buyers from the United States. It's a report by Emerald Maxwell.
They're the new white gold. For the past few weeks, demand for surgical face masks has surged, with orders flooding into China from countries facing shortages. This Chinese plane is carrying 2 million masks bound for eastern France, just a small part of the 1.5 billion that the French government has ordered. But not all the orders are arriving safely.
Ce matin, sur le tarmac en Chine, une commande française a été achetée par les Américains cash sur le tarmac, et l'avion qui devait venir en France est parti directement aux États-Unis.
France has itself been accused by a Swedish company of having requisitioned masks destined for Italy and Spain. The fierce competition is playing out internationally, but also on French soil. The government has reserved all masks for medical workers and is cracking down on the black market of the now precious items. Once they've arrived in the country, the masks now receive police escorts.
On a nos véhicules qui sont devant en ouvreuse, le véhicule qui ferme derrière qui est le chef de mission, et on s'assure que quasiment personne ne remonte le convoi. Le but, c'est que ça ne soit pas volé, qu'on tombe pas sur des guet-apens ou autre chose.
Today, only 4 French companies manufacture masks. Their machines are now running 24 hours a day, guarded by the military. They've gone from producing 15 million to 40 million masks a month. Still just a fraction of the 40 million masks that France now needs per week.
Your reaction to that story, Christopher Dickey?
Well, my reaction is that we're seeing the worst face of capitalism and the worst face of the disorganization of the multiple governments around the world. I mean, I think it's terrible if the U.S. outbid basically France or Eastern France on the runway. That's terrible. But we see that happening in the United States, among states. Right now, we see a complete supply chain that's in complete chaos as states are bidding against each other within the United States. And the American government seems incapable of resolving this crisis. So it's a terrible situation. It's exactly where government is needed.
Out, you think?
Huh? I'm
Is
sorry?
it something that can get worked out?
Sure, it can get worked out eventually, but eventually is something we don't have. Right now is when things need to be worked out. We need people to come up with the right solutions and implement them immediately or yesterday. And we're not seeing that in the United States, and frankly, we're not seeing it globally.
Mandakini Gahlot?
So when Christopher says that, we're seeing the worst face of capitalism, this is something that we're seeing here in India too. Now, this is already a country that had a lot of inequality, and it's worsening with this current situation. Let's take the example of testing. You cannot get a test in government hospitals unless you have a cough, a fever, travel history, contacts. There's a huge list. But if you can afford it, and you can go to a private lab, you can pay about 50 euros and you can have a test quite easily. So what I'm worried about is that in countries like India and the developing world, we're going to see a situation where the rich and the well-off will be able to save themselves. They will be able to get tests. They will be able to access healthcare. But the poor, the migrant workers on whose backs these economies have been built, are not going to have any access to care at all.
Sylvie Kauffmann, people are talking about how there could be a rethink.
Well, this is, it's very interesting what Mandakini has described, because this is one of the issues which is already coming out of this crisis. It's the spotlight on social inequality. Look, in France, what we see is that well-off people like me can work from home and live in comfortable apartments, while the people who are on the front line are daily workers, not only health sector workers like nurses and doctors, but cashiers of supermarkets, people who collect the rubbish in the streets, all these workers that we don't so much pay attention to because they are so much part of our everyday life, but they are out in the streets, obviously the police force, all the security forces. And we discovered that, our livelihood depends on them at the moment. And so many of them don't have the necessary protections, again, against the disease.
Yes, Sylvie, I was speaking with the head of IT at France 24. His daughter is 13 years old. She's in middle school, and 25 kids in the class. He said roughly 10 of them are able to follow the online schooling without a problem. He said the others, they either have bad internet connections or they're going to fall behind even further. And so that inequality is growing during confinement.
Yeah, it's education is a big issue because, of course, the children whose parents can homeschool them with the help of teachers online, of course. But as you say, you need to have a computer at home. Are much better off after 2 months if this lockdown lasts 2 months, which is not impossible. They will be much better off at the end than the children whose parents maybe don't speak French properly or don't have internet connections or are too busy or working, are too busy working as cashiers in the supermarket to school them during the day. So yes, this is a very serious issue, and it's something we debate a lot and we talk a lot about it at the moment. And this morning the decision was taken by the Minister of Education about the baccalaureate, the end of high school exam, which is usually held in June, and the government has decided that it couldn't be organized normally this year. So
grades and a jury.
Right. So you'll have, it will be given on the basis of your grades during the school year. But again, if you haven't been prepared for this, it's the outcome will maybe different for different children, or different students. So this is this inequality in education. At least we have equality in the health sector. Your health doesn't depend on your income in France, and that's I mean, the treatment you're going to get in hospital, whether you're poor or rich, will be the same. We have a very strong medical insurance.
Unlike the United States, Christopher Dickey, where most people's healthcare is tied to whether or not they're employed.
Sure, and we now have about 10 million people who are unemployed as a result of this crisis and the shutdown that's been going on. So a lot of them didn't have insurance to begin with, but those 10 million basically are bereft of insurance. Then you have 11 million people or so who are classified as illegal aliens. They're not likely to have insurance. And in fact, the Trump administration has done everything it can, and its acolytes have done everything they can to cut them out of healthcare, to cut them out of any kind of insurance. So the net result of all this, not only in medicine, not only with healthcare, the net result of a catastrophe like this is to lay the foundations for a revolution. That's just historical in any society when you have this kind of cataclysm.
A revolution?
Yeah, sure. Let's say we have a minimum of 100,000 people die over the next 2 months, 3 months. Let's say it's higher than that. Let's say it's 250,000. Let's say it's 1 million. It is perfectly conceivable that the numbers could reach that level. Do you think people are going to go back and say, we want things to be just like they were before? I don't think so. And I think the chances for this to disintegrate into real social unrest are enormous, not only in the United States, not only in India, not only in France, but almost anywhere in the world that is hit by this pandemic. That is going to be a problem. And I don't see that the governments of the world are any more ready for that than they were for the pandemic to begin with.
Sylvie Kauffmann, you agree?
Well, if you look at past pandemics, usually, yes, they were followed by social unrest and deep social dislocation. Now, of course, it depends also on who is most affected, which categories of the population. And this, we don't know at the moment. It's mostly in Europe, it's mostly older people, but the evolution of the pandemic might be different. We don't know. I mean, there are so many things about this crisis that we can't forecast because we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know how huge the number of victims will be. But I tend to agree that the world will be different when it's over. And, it's very difficult to put a criteria of when it's over. Because it won't be over overnight. But I think the world will be different. Yeah.
There is possibly good news. French health authorities, at least here in France, French health authorities say they expect the peak of new infections to come perhaps as early as next Monday. For the first time this week, the Prime Minister talked about deconfinement. I looked it up. The word actually does exist in the dictionary. Okay. But of course, there are going to be conditions to that. And one of them is talking, Sylvie Kauffmann, about having smartphone apps that could track those like they do in Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, who have tested positive or who are carriers of COVID-19.
Yes. I mean, the Prime Minister yesterday talked about deconfinement, saying that it wouldn't happen overnight, that it would have to be gradual. And already people are criticizing him, saying he's talking about deconfinement too early because we're not there yet. So people may get excited about, going out. But this tracking device, this tracking issue is another debate here, that it's been working very, very well in Asia. In East Asia, particularly in South Korea, in Japan, in China, but in Europe we tend to have different approaches or different attitudes towards tracking. We're much more cautious about this, so it remains to be seen how well it can be accepted by people. My impression is that the fear is so big, and when we realize the dimension of this crisis, people will be more flexible on this.
Mandakini Gahlot, in tech-savvy India, where there are more people with smartphones than ID papers, would something like this work?
Well, and don't forget, it's the IT sort of IT backroom of the world. And so, of course, this has already been discussed quite a bit. And just yesterday, the government launched an app that allows you to sort of log in and see if you've been anywhere around somebody who has tested positive. But beyond that, they've also been, since these efforts are not centralized, different states have different technologies that they're harnessing. So some states are doing things like using apps to monitor people who are under quarantine, or asking people to send a selfie every hour. And this has triggered a debate about privacy. I mean, there was already a lot of concern around surveillance in India before this outbreak. This was challenged repeatedly in Indian courts. A lot of these apps, including the Prime Minister's own app, the Namo app, was collecting data of Indians and then passing it on to a third party in the United States. So those concerns haven't disappeared overnight. And it looks like for the moment, there's no room to have this debate anymore, because the government's very clearly said that stopping this epidemic, or at least pulling back the number of cases, is the priority. So I expect we'll see surveillance efforts increase, and there's nothing anyone's going to be able to do about stopping it.
Nothing anyone's going to be able to do about stopping it. We did a show on this, Christopher Dickey, this week with a privacy rights advocate. I was quite surprised to hear him say, look, I just have to be open with open eyes here and realistic about this. Personal rights are the first casualty when you're in a warlike situation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that a lot of people are going to say, if this will help, great. But here's the problem. It isn't just privacy rights. It's that it's just too late. I mean, when South Korea was doing all this tracking, which has enabled them to keep up their production, keep going more or less with a normal life by isolating the people who have the disease, they did massive testing, hundreds of thousands of tests very quickly. And it was all an integrated policy in which, the number of deaths, I think 169 total deaths in South Korea. So that gives you an idea what happens if you react early. But the people we're talking about, the countries we're talking about, did not react early, which is why in France, Edouard Philippe, the prime minister yesterday, was talking about deconfinement as a gradual process. And we're talking about using these apps as part of a very gradual process. People have this illusion that one day the government will say, okay, let's go back to normal. In fact, I have to give President Macron here credit. He was very clear when he imposed the lockdown at the beginning, and he said, we're going to beat this thing, but the day after tomorrow is not going to be the same as the day before this started. And that's what people need to keep in mind.
Let's talk about the day after tomorrow, because we heard the case made for the EU pooling its resources, because it's going to be a long road to recovery afterwards, physically for a lot of people, but also for the economies here in Europe. The French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, gave an interview to France 24 and Radio France International, in which he made the case for those Corona bonds, the idea being that European nations pool their debt. Let's listen.
The mechanism to achieve some form of stability would be a common European fund of 240 billion euros and make it available to the 19 members of the Eurozone. And more is needed. It is better to share the debt now with low interest rates, which is what we are proposing, and have this financing available now rather than letting our economy melt down. There is only one European Union, not Southern or Northern Europe or Western or Eastern Europe. Each member has its own history, but we are politically united.
Sylvie Kauffmann, of course, we're not there yet when it comes to Corona bonds. There was an interview given to La Repubblica by the new president of the European Commission, Germany's Ursula von der Leyen, in which she apologized for not coming to the aid of Italy early in this crisis. But she also said, quote, In the past month, the European Commission has left no stone unturned to help Italy. Nonetheless, she didn't say word one about these Corona bonds.
No, because as you said, we're not there yet, and Corona bonds may not be the response eventually. We don't know. They're working on it at the moment in the Eurogroup. I think France is trying hard to convince Germany that we need, some move of a very, very important, of a huge size. We need to, the southern states like Spain and Italy are calling for a Marshall Plan. And yesterday, Mrs. von der Leyen said the budget can be the Marshall Plan. So the idea she was putting forward yesterday was to use the European budget and inject, massive funds into this budget and use it for the rest of the countries which need it. So I don't think governments have to be completely fixated on those Corona bonds. I mean, the term itself, the Corona bonds, is interesting because it speaks to people. But technically, Germany hates it. The Netherlands don't like it either. So maybe to overcome their resistance, other tools can be found. And I think that's what the French government is working on, to find an agreement with the Germans. But what has to be clear is that the message has to be massive. I mean, the European Union cannot, muddle through this crisis as it usually does. We like to say that the EU progresses through crisis, but this is not an ordinary crisis. It's not even the euro crisis that we had 10 years ago. This is much more serious than it, and all our economies are crashing down. So, what to fix that, to fix those severe contractions that we're going to go through and that we're already going through, we'll need really a massive common effort.
Are we up to the task, Christopher Dickey?
Not right now. Let's hope that we are eventually. I mean, if we want to be optimistic, I think there are all kinds of different revolutions. It may be that the financial and economic comeback will be absolutely explosive after this. We could be looking at the roaring 2020s when we get through this crisis. We could be looking at the next Trente Glorieuses after this crisis. The next 30 years of development and building. We could be. Right now, we're not seeing the kind of coordination or Marshall Plan that would make that possible, but it's conceivable because people will want something new and different. They will want to recover, and they will want to work to recover. If the governments fail them, then you will have really a revolutionary situation. If the governments can function and make it happen, it could be very positive at the end of the day, but the end of the day is years away.
Yeah, what would those roaring 20s look like? Will it be just buying and selling all the stuff we didn't sell and buy during this period? Or will it be the time for that Green New Deal that some have been talking about?
Well, if you're asking me, I mean, one of the things my friends keep talking about, it's kind of pie in the sky, is the salutary environmental effect of locking everybody down like this. The air's rarely been cleaner here in Paris, and in places like Beijing, you can see the sky for a change. So that's good news. Now, maybe there's something to be learned about that, because the other crisis that's going to come on the heels of this is, of course, the climate crisis. And people have not taken it seriously, but I think the same people who tried to ignore the possibility of a pandemic are in many cases the people who want to tell you that there's no climate crisis on the horizon. Well, there is a pandemic, there is a climate crisis on the horizon, and maybe we'll see people waking up.
Mandakini Gahlot, give us the weather in New Delhi.
Well, the skies have never been so blue, and the air is as fresh as you can expect at this time of the year. So it's horrible to say, but like Christopher was saying, this is sort of the perk of the lockdown and the slowing down of the economy, is that We have fresh air in Delhi after many, many, many years. But just coming back to your point about how all of this will end, there was something Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that really struck with me when he addressed the nation. He said, if you cannot handle the next 21 days in isolation, then this country could go back 21 years. So there are real fears about how the Indian economy will fare at the end of this, because it's not that it's come to a halt. It's also that they'll have to find a way to feed hundreds and millions of people as long as this ends.
Hundreds of millions of people. And how's democracy doing in India?
Well, there's already, we're already seeing press freedom being curtailed. The Prime Minister had a sort of Skype meeting with editors of the major newspapers and television channels, where he said, he requested that they try and cover more positive news. And only a few days after that, the Supreme Court handed down an order that said that the media cannot carry any information that's not verified. Verified by who, I don't really know, because the Indian government's not really upfront about revealing data, not even data about how many masks there are or personal protective equipment kits there are. So we're already seeing efforts to muzzle the press, and that's never a good sign for a democracy.
Never a good sign for a democracy. Sylvie Kauffmann, a lot of attention in the past week has been put on those emergency laws that have been put in place here in Europe. In Hungary, again, it's the same question I put to Mandakini. What's democracy going to look like when this is all over?
Yeah, we can see all over the world authoritarian leaders taking advantage of this crisis to strengthen their power. We've seen that in China, of course, and in Europe. Unfortunately, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban took advantage. I mean, had a law passed to enable him to govern by decree, which, you know, many other governments, including the French government, is doing because of this emergency crisis. But most or the other governments are putting time limits to these emergency powers, while the Hungarian Prime Minister decided to do it for an unlimited length. So the EU has been protesting already. There have been, you know, a letter signed by 14 European governments yesterday, including the French one, protesting at this Hungarian attitude. But we can see that in Poland also there's a presidential election scheduled for May 10. And they're trying to organize it via mail, which is also a problem, because you don't organize proper presidential elections through the post office. So we see, yes, a lot of challenges on this front, and that we have to face as well.
All right, let's talk about, before we leave, about personal challenges. I'm going to go around the room and ask each one of you, the virtual room, and ask each one of you. I'll begin with you, Sylvie Kauffmann. How have you taken advantage of confinement? What's the activity you've done that you don't usually do?
Well, going out, socializing.
What have you been doing instead, is my question.
Instead, well, I've been working around the clock, more or almost. You know, I'm lucky in a way because my children are grown up, so I don't have to homeschool them. I don't have to feed them. They're students or already living elsewhere, so everybody's fine, which is great. But yeah, I find that at the moment confinement has a lot to do with working.
Is that the same for you, Christopher Dickey?
Absolutely. I'm working just as hard as ever, and I'm working in the same place that I usually work, which is this room. So it isn't a big change in that sense. I will say, on the positive side, that because we have my wife's mother with us, and because she's a great Italian-American woman, and my wife is a great Italian-American cook, we've been eating really, really well. I don't think we've ever eaten this well. It's not only dinners, it's lunches, it's breakfasts, it's everything. I suppose I'm anxious because I'm not putting on much weight. I don't know why that is, but I've never eaten as well as we're eating now.
The Germans call this big danger, it's Corona Speck.
Corona Speck. How are
Yes.
you avoiding Corona Speck, Mandakini?
Well, I always thought if I had a lot of time to spend at home, I'd read all kinds of books, self-care and things like that. But like Sylvie and like Christopher, I seem to be spending most of my time working. I mean, we're journalists and somehow we're working even more from home than we were before from the bureau. So pretty much working all the time.
All right, well, don't work too hard, Mandakini Gahlot. I want to thank you so much for joining us from Delhi. I want to thank Sylvie Kauffmann, Christopher Dickey for being with us again in a confined edition of The World this week. And yeah, your reactions have certainly powered us. We want to thank you so much for all your feedback. And again, we're going to keep that conversation going. And the conversation does continue on our website, france24.com.